All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Deconversion Stories. And today I have the great pleasure of chatting with Dr. David Kyle Johnson, who has authored many books. And I think one of the coolest things about this human being is that he loves to mix the philosophy with the science fiction, which I totally get, because if you've watched shows like Star Trek or now I hate it when this happens. Babylon 5, you'll see a lot of different races with a lot of different philosophies, which clearly stem from human philosophies, obviously. But first, we're going to talk about how David left religion behind, and we'll get into all the cool stuff after that. But so, Doc, should I call you Doc or David? Or
you call me Kyle, it's fine.
Or Kyle?
Yeah.
Okay, so you go by Kyle usually?
It's David Kyle Johnson. My dad is David. I am Kyle.
I got you. Okay. Well, Kyle, welcome to the show. I'm glad you're
thanks for having me, Neil.
Decided to do this. This should be a lot of fun. Oh, by the way, guys, he's excited for the after party and to meeting, one of his biggest fans there, V. Rose LaBianca, in the chat there. So let's get into this. So tell me, when you were a believer, let's kind of go back a bit and to sort of describe to me what you first sort of thought, how you first sort of thought to yourself that this stuff may not be as believable as you once thought, and what led you away from it and getting into sort of becoming an atheist and philosophy and stuff like that.
Okay, well, the short answer is the short of the story is the answer. It's philosophy that essentially led me away. But the story is a bit more complicated than that. So sure. I grew up in a very conservative religion. And called Nazarenes. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Nazarenes.
Yes.
Yes. I actually have right here still.
You're just like me. Everything's in reach.
Yes. From those days, I have an old
wooden
Church of the Nazarene emblem from back in the day. And so I grew up in that church, and I was very heavy into it. I planned on being a preacher. I was a Bible quizzer. Have you ever heard of Bible quizzing?
Yeah.
So I had entire books of the Bible essentially memorized, where I could quote them front to back.
I actually got to voice Ray Comfort in a Bible quiz type thing that Prophet of Zod did on his channel. So
interesting.
It was kind of fun.
Yeah, so in the 90s, you could find me in churches in Oklahoma with a bunch of other teenagers lined up against the wall, all ready to jump or whatever as to answer Bible questions. So if I recall, however, like in Sunday school and stuff, I was always the one that asked questions that people like the Sunday school teacher didn't like, right?
Right, sure.
But
I hear you there.
But I still believed in, that kind of stuff. And I went to school to become a pastor. But there I discovered philosophy. I actually worked in a church at the time as part of an internship program. And at the same time I was doing that, I discovered philosophy. And I remember the first big philosophical question I was asked was about personal identity over time. What makes my 8-year-old self and me now the same person? And I remember right where I was when it was that question was first posed to me and stuff. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And so after, through taking Introduction to Philosophy, I kind of realized that that's what I really wanted to do. That being a pastor really was a way to preach, and really the way to preach was really teaching is what I wanted to do. And then I realized that like being a professor was what you'd actually do if you were going to teach about this kind of stuff.
Sure.
And I also quickly worried that I was really bad at like the people skills and stuff like that.
Which you're clearly not, dude.
Working in a church, those kind of people skills. Anyway, so I started to study to become a philosopher. And so when I was an undergrad, and again, I do not blame my professor at all for this. This is all me. But the big, I remember when the moment turned, when things started to turn, was the semester. And I think this was in my junior year. And I could, whatever semester it would have been when The Matrix came out. So I think that this would have been 99. I do remember that because I remember
2000, somewhere around there. Yeah.
Right. So I think it would have been spring of 99. And I remember that not because The Matrix played any kind of role, because I remember what class I was in whenever that movie happened. Sure. And that semester I took philosophy of religion and New Testament theology at the same time. And in New Testament theology, I came to realize that sacrificial atonement, the bedrock of all Christianity, was bunk. That it absolutely made no sense to think that you had an all-powerful, perfect God and all-loving, and then somehow he had to torture someone in order to forgive your sins, right? I mean, I wrote a paper on this and that kind of stuff. I actually got a perfect grade on that paper I wrote back in college from my New Testament teacher. Well, it's like I can forgive someone without having to step on their toes, right? Why can't God, a perfect being, do this? It doesn't accomplish justice like it supposedly does. And then at the same time, taking philosophy of religion, I realized that the arguments for God did not actually work as well as I thought they did. That the argument from evil, the problem of evil, was pretty substantial. It wasn't enough to make me give it up at that point, but I started realizing that you couldn't argue to it. It just had to be a matter of faith. And so I essentially left college, still a theist, but believing that, like, and even still a Christian, I believe, like, I had this whole spiel about, to be a Christian, one has to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, essentially. Sure. But then I had this, really neat way of defining what Messiah meant.
Do tell.
Right. Well, I mean, essentially it just meant, like, it didn't have to include being divine. It didn't have to include miracles, right? It had to essentially be like God's chosen prophet or something like that, right? But that's how I could still justify calling myself a Christian, because I still believe that God exists, God is love, and that Jesus was Messiah. I thought those are the three requirements to call yourself a Christian.
Sure. Yeah,
and I had this definition of Messiah in line, right? So then I go to grad school at University of Oklahoma, and was basically, well, not basically, I was a philosophy of religion. I wrote my dissertation on the freedom foreknowledge problem. But I took a number of, metaphysics and philosophy of science and lots of philosophy of religion courses, and all the, the repertoire of philosophy courses that you would take with a PhD. And by the time I was done there, I realized that the Messiah thing that didn't really work well. I was basically just kind of ad hocing my way into Christianity. I was redefining things so I could still use terms like call myself a Christian when I really wasn't.
Now, why would you, did you feel that maybe you weren't going to be complete as a person if you had just dropped it completely?
I still believed that God existed, basically as a matter of faith, and I can't fully articulate why I did at the time. I just hadn't become, essentially, I hadn't been convinced that the arguments against worked. And so I was like, so I could just be like, I could say, well, there's not enough evidence to settle or to not settle it or whatever. And so I'll still believe by faith, right? And that I thought it was acceptable to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And so by the time that I'm, graduated, getting my PhD, I'm still a theist, right? And I have a, PhD in philosophy of religion. But, I still went to church too. I just don't know if I would call myself a Christian at that point. It's kind of fuzzy in there. So, I mean, I'm trying to think back in my own history. I may be misremembering my own history. Maybe I still call myself a Christian, and the Messiah thing doesn't give up until after grad school. I'm not exactly sure on the timeline there. But that goes away. And then I continue my studies, right? And I continue teaching philosophy of religion. I continue writing about it. I turned my dissertation on the freedom foreknowledge problem into my first kind of big published paper. But I continue reading on theism and the arguments for and against and that kind of stuff. And what eventually, so the semester that turned the tide again was not turn the tide. That pushed me even further over. I taught a independent study with a very, very bright one of our majors. He's a math major and a philosophy major, and he wanted an independent study on atheism. And I was like, that sounds fascinating. That's great.
Let's do this.
and so, right. We studied on it, and we read up a bunch of it. We read the arguments for and against, yada yada yada, and I read people like William Rowe was one that sticks out.
Sure.
And was like, yeah, this is pretty convincing. It looks like all the arguments and logic and that kind of stuff are on that side. And I had always been, since I was a tyke. I had, and he actually still sits here on my desk to remind me of this. role model of mine when I was growing up was Spock.
Beautiful.
Right. And I had always fancied myself a very logical and very logical person, that I proportioned my belief to the evidence. I went where the evidence led. And when I was a theist, I thought, well, the evidence is not either for or against, and so I can still believe by faith. But after that semester, I realized that, well, where the evidence lies is really on the atheism side. The arguments for God don't work. The arguments against them are pretty persuasive. I do think they definitely show that a perfect God can exist. And I also came to realize things about faith that, I had been taught since I was little that faith was a virtue, and studying epistemology and that kind of stuff, realized that that's not actually the case. Believing something without evidence is not actually
it's fun.
Yeah. And so, but I realized that no, it's not virtuous to believe something without evidence. That's not actually a good way to be.
Right.
So, through that semester, I basically kind of realized privately that I didn't believe anymore. But I still went to church. But what made me gay? So there was two things that made me give up. There's kind of two things that are going on here. There's me in church and me in theism, like publicly kind of admitting to being a theist. What made me give up church was the realization that I was adding legitimacy to the church I was going to by being there. Like, you got a doctorate, and
sure,
right?
Makes sense, yeah.
Right. And I was adding legitimacy to it, and I did not agree with what was going on. I did not agree at all with what was being preached, what people were doing, what people were saying. Honestly, it was the early stages of Trumpism that was going on and that I was recognizing in this particular local church. And I was like, I can't be involved in this anymore. I can't add legitimacy to it anymore. And so I had to get out. Right. And then with theism, again, I'd kind of privately realized what was going on, but I wasn't public about it until I was reading, see if I can find it.
Look at that bookshelf. I'm jealous, man.
Oh, thanks. Where is it? I know it's here. All right, so I can't find it offhand here. It's just called God ? A debate between an atheist and a theist. And,
okay.
the atheist and theist, it's William Lane Craig as the theist,
of course,
and Armstrong is the atheist there.
Right.
And I remember reading this book, and I was reading Armstrong's end of the argument at one point, and like Armstrong at one point, I don't even forget. Like, you can look up, if you look up my my blog, A Logical Take, I have a post on William Lane Craig, and it's actually about Colbert. It's about Stephen Colbert, Ricky Gervais, and then William Lane Craig. But in that particular blog post, I spell out exactly what was going on in the book at the time, but I don't remember exactly what it is offhand. But essentially, I remember Armstrong going, now I'm making this argument, and I'm saying X. Now, some people might interpret me as saying Y. I am not saying Y. Clearly, Y is false. I am not ascribing to Y. That's why I'm not saying it. It's not at all what I'm saying. I'm specifically saying X. And he spends 2 pages or whatever it was, clearly making this point. And then Craig admits it, gets to his rebuttal, and Craig essentially says, "Hey, look at Armstrong. He says Y. That's ridiculous." Right? And I was like, and at that point, I was like, I can't be on this team anymore. Like, it's just, it's so bad. It's so a lot. This is like William Lane Craig is like the champion of theists and apologists, right? Like, he's supposed to be the cream of the crop, and he's just making simple, dumb, logical mistakes. And I was like, I'm done. I got to be out. I can't be on this team anymore, right? Like, publicly, it's an embarrassment to be on this team, essentially. And so that's when I kind of okay, I kind of came out as publicly as atheist then.
Wow.
And that would have been, I think, around 2007, 8, 9, something in there. I'd have to look back at my records when that course was or whatever. But
did it have any effect on your relations with your family or anything like that?
A little bit, but we got beyond it.
That's awesome, because that doesn't always happen.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Right.
And I mean, mainly, I just don't bring it up anymore. I did bring it up. I told certain family members, and they were, upset about it at the time, but they didn't berate me or anything like that. I got, some gentle prodding and that kind of stuff, but nothing. It's fine. It's fine. It doesn't affect us at all anymore. So
that's good. Yeah, because I've heard many stories where things didn't go as well as they did for you, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and
including,
that's fair. I mean,
like disowning and all kinds of stuff, right? So I've talked to hundreds of people doing this show, And when I hear that things turned out well and families weren't torn up over this, it always does my heart good, because at least we know that there's some sensibility with some people anyways, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have a great family, very loving family.
That's awesome. Me too.
So,
I'm lucky that way as well.
And I can say that knowing that they will never watch this, right? So I'm not like sucking up or anything like that. But
maybe they'll watch that segment.
Maybe so, right? No, but they're great. Right? No, my parents are great. My wife is great. Everyone's, it's been wonderful. Yeah.
That's good. So that's pretty much it, I guess, for how you got out of there. So
yeah, I mean, there's lots of details. Like I can tell you about the arguments, that kind of stuff. Because it was a slow process. Like this. I mean, I just told you a story that took like 15 years, right? Like,
sure.
It's like one of the first things to go for me was belief in the Trinity, right?
Okay.
And then like, I mean, it was just like one little thing that kind of whittled away at a time until like the big event was that semester where I gave up belief in atonement and realizing that God's existence couldn't be argued to, right?
So like a dominoes falling kind of thing.
Yeah, I always kind of think of it as just like this chunk, and I'm just slowly whittling away, kind of one belief at a time.
Right.
Until I'm literally down to like it's God exists and God is love at the end, and then finally I just get rid of that. But
that's good. So you have a blog. I didn't realize that, because when I was looking up your stuff to add the links down below, which by the way, guys, I have his Twitter's, Facebook, his LinkedIn, where you can pick up his latest book, which is Black Mirror and Philosophy, with the colon and then dark. What's it again? Dark Reflections. There it is. Yeah. Which is a great series, by the way. It's like a modern day Twilight Zone, really.
Yes, it is very much so. Yeah.
But I didn't realize that you actually had a blog. I also put the Psychology Today link that talks about you there.
Yeah. So that's where the blog is on Psychology Today. Actually, I maintain two blogs for Psychology Today. One's called Plato on Pop. That is William Irwin and I's. We jointly do a blog on philosophy and pop culture.
I saw that there.
So like my articles on Star Wars and Star Trek and that, that kind of stuff, right?
Sure.
Is there. And then I have another one called A Logical Take, where I essentially just analyze things that are in the news or you see on Facebook and that kind of stuff logically. I just kind of look for logical fallacies and evaluate what they are and that kind of stuff.
Spock would be proud.
Yeah, he would be very proud. So I am our school's logician. I teach the logic courses. When people minor in logic, I'm the professor who guides them through. So that's so my latest article on the logical take blog was about how the wildfires in Australia are a result of climate change, not arson. There's climate deniers and that kind of stuff who are claiming
which is nuts in my opinion.
Yeah.
So in the chat now, Dr. Slade is with us.
Okay.
And
hi, Dr. Slade.
And he said he wrote chapter 21 of Black Mirror and Philosophy.
Oh, yeah. You said, if you would have said, never mind.
Dr. Darren.
If you would have said Darren, I would have known who you were talking about.
Well, I had him on the show earlier, actually.
Yes, you did. In fact, me watching his episode is why I kind of invited myself or suggested to you that I be on here. So, but yeah, there's Darren's chapter right there.
Awesome.
On striking vipers. So yeah, so the book is, if you like Black Mirror, I would say it's a must-have. It's unlike others. So there's a whole series of these books with William Irwin, the Pop Culture and Philosophy series. This treats things a little bit differently. The other books kind of use the pop culture to raise philosophical questions in a kind of general way, which is fine, which is great. I've done a number of those and written like 20 articles for it. That's awesome. But with Black Mirror, I wanted to do something different because I think that each episode's making an argument. And it's got a position, it's raising a question, something along that. It's doing philosophy. And so in the book, we dedicate a chapter to each and every episode. So you don't need to read the book in order, just like you don't need to watch the series in order. It's like Twilight Zone, every episode self-contained. So you can skip around the book and, read the chapters on your favorite episodes. Or you can even watch the series for the first time. And go in any order and then read the chapters that go with those episodes. The end of the book is 6 general theme chapters about the series as a whole. We have Bandersnatch is the Choose Your Own Adventure chapter, or is the it's a Choose Your Own Adventure episode. The Bandersnatch is a Choose Your Own Adventure episode, and we wrote a Choose Your Own Adventure chapter for the book.
That's brilliant.
It's really fun. It's a choose your own philosophical adventure. So instead of instead of like in a regular choose your own adventure book, you decide what to do. In ours, you decide what question you want to ask and explore. And then it goes off, and there's like 5 different endings to the chapter. It's lots of fun.
That sounds awesome, actually.
But anyway, I'm kind of sidetracked, but
that's okay. That's what this is all about, really, half the time.
Cool.
Yeah, I like sidetracking because we can get into some interesting things doing that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's not a lot of atheism or anything in the book because Black Mirror doesn't kind of lend itself to those kind of topics, except for an episode called San Junipero, which talks about the afterlife. And the chapter on that particular episode is essentially about whether or not you'd really want to live in San Junipero, whether or not an afterlife is a good idea. That particular kind of afterlife is a good idea. Great chapter, really good.
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting episode, to be honest.
Oh yeah, it's really good.
And I dug the 80s theme to it.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
Yeah, that was actually one of my favorite episodes. The other one I really, really liked was the episode with the social media where, the girl that's always trying to improve her nosedive. That's right. Improve her status. And then, of course, that one little incident changed everything, right?
Right, yeah. Started her on a nosedive, right? Yeah, it's a great episode. Yeah. And the particular chapter on that is really good, too.
Cool. I definitely have to get this book now.
Oh, yeah, you've got to. It's great. It's so much fun. And it's not too expensive, like $20 on Amazon.
Cool.
Nosedive is actually Nosedive illustrates a number of different things. One of the things it's talked about in the chapter is Sartre's look. And so I won't go into detail on that, but it's in the chapter. And that's actually what I talked about when I talked about it in Sci-Fi, in my great course called Sci-Fi, Science Fiction as Philosophy. The lecture that deals with Black Mirror deals with Nosedive. Like I chose that episode to concentrate on.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. I think it's one that impacted me the most. It was one of the first ones that I actually watched. So I just thought, wow, could you imagine if we ended up with that kind of a measuring stick through social media for who you are as a person? That would just blow me away, I think. Yeah,
well, horrifying fun fact, they're actually already doing it in China. There's places in China that are experimenting with something very, very similar to what you see in Nosedive, essentially a social credit system.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's mentioned in the chapter if you want to know more about it.
All right. I'll definitely look into that.
That's one of the things I wanted to make sure that the book did was identify many of the disturbing times where Black Mirror kind of predicted the future, where what it depicts ended up happening not too long after.
We know Star Trek was good at that.
Yeah. Well, and some things are like some of that was self-fulfilling prophecy. Like our flip phones look like Star Trek communicators, but it turns out that was like on purpose. The people who designed the flip phones were Star Trek fans.
Is that right? Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was definitely inspired by it. Yeah.
My boss has an actual Star Trek communicator that you can flip open, and it Bluetooth connects to your phone, so you can use it as your phone.
That is awesome. I have a little one over here, but it does not Bluetooth to my phone. That is awesome.
I'll find out where he got it, and I'll let you know. Because
cool!
It's very, very cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I kind of want to get one myself. It's a little on the pricey side, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, so like
flip up, that thing.
So one more thing about Black Mirror, and then we can talk about something else. But one of the other things so here's one of my favorite chapters in the book. Is the chapter on Hated in the Nation, which if you've seen it, it's the one about the robotic bees that kill everybody because Twitter votes on them, and whoever has as many death to hashtags, like hashtag death to whoever has the most of those gets killed that day, right? It turns out that episode aired a year almost to the day before hashtag Me Too came out. Like became a thing, and started not killing people, right? But it can end people's careers and that kind of stuff, right? And Elaine Meyer writes this chapter where she really it's this great the moral of the episode is online shaming is always wrong, always bad, can never do any good. But it came a year before Me Too, and Me Too can do some good, right? Like gets called out. Harvey Weinstein, and it's called out like a lot of good things have happened. And so it's like this, so there's dangers, but there's also benefits. How do you find this balance between, kind of online shaming and the kind of attention that like it can definitely overreact, but then it can also give power to the voiceless. How do you find that middle ground? It's a wonderful chapter. It's a very well balanced, very well reasoned chapter.
It's a difficult thing to do as well.
Yes, it is. It's really touchy. It's really
Yeah.
touchy. It was I thought one of the most important chapters in the book. And so I gave it to people here on campus that I considered to be kind of on both ends of that debate. And it actually upset them both, which was, I thought, like, okay, that's like, we're kind of in the middle there, right? But like, I think I should say early versions of it upset them both. And I think that we revised it in light of comments and that kind of stuff. And I really think we ended up with a really nice chapter in the end that's not upsetting to either side and really makes you think about those kinds of issues. Anyway.
That's great. That's good that you were able to do that, to bring sort of the level of hostility, I suppose, down a bit.
Right.
A good question was asked here in the chat. I'll just pop it up here. My friend Sassy, she said, ask Kyle what his thoughts are on coexisting with others, regardless of belief or disbelief.
Yeah. Okay. God, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So I will say this. All right. It depends on what the belief or disbelief is. Right.
I agree.
So, right. Like, so you can agree. So like, I mean, I've got colleagues, both here at King's and elsewhere, right, who are theists, right? And I can get along with them just fine. And we can even have healthy discussions. Right below me is the theology department here at King's. And I've got good friends there. And we have great lunch discussions and that kind of stuff, and can show respect for each other. Because, I mean, honestly, because I know that they've thought hard about what they believe and they're serious about it. And they're, you know, their kind of theism is not overtly ignorant or anything like that, right? Like they're not, they understand the problems, they know what they stand, they've thought about this, that kind of stuff. And then of course I've got family members and that kind of stuff. And you can get along with people that you disagree with about these kinds of issues, right? And if they want to talk about it, great, but you don't have to bring it up. But if you don't, that's fine. And right, like as long as you don't think that they're doing damage, right, in the world or to specific people, right, then that's okay, right? But I'm not going to agree to disagree with like neo-Nazis. I'm not going to agree to disagree with racists. I'm not, right? So and so that's where you can kind of draw the line. So it depends on what they believe or they don't believe, right, as to how well you get along with them and that kind of stuff, right? And
sure.
You've got to cut ties with some people if they've got beliefs that are damaging, that they're damaging to others, and they're not open to discussion or revising their beliefs about it. But I mean, it's a just like with what we were just talking about, like there's a balancing act to be found there, right? You got to figure out. I mean, essentially, you got to figure out what kind of things are worth fighting for, and what aren't.
True.
So. Another example, I don't have the book on me because it's not actually out yet. I wrote, this one actually has to do with atheism. I wrote a chapter for the forthcoming Saturday Night Live in Philosophy book.
Really?
Yeah, and I wrote it on Saturday Night Live in religion. They wanted a chapter that was kind of on how Saturday Night Live takes on religion. Okay. And so what I ended up doing was talking about a bunch of different sketches that they've done in regards to religion. So when Jesus visited Tebow in the Broncos locker room, whenever he was given, crediting God for his, wins, his NFL wins.
Yeah.
There was the time that they did that Tarantino mock trailer where it was revenge history, except it was Jesus, and it was called "The Jesus Uncrossed." And Christoph Waltz was Jesus and like shooting people with shotguns, that kind of stuff. There's the church lady, of course. There was the Religestables, which was a take on VeggieTales. But what I frame it with is that time that Sinead O'Connor tore up a picture of the Pope.
Of the Pope, yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And I started with that, and I think like it ended her career. It essentially ended her career. The chapter's kind of motivated by like, so why did that end her career? But, the Jesus Uncrossed didn't end Christoph Waltz's career, or all these, like Saturday Night Live is blasphemous all the time. Like Louis C.K. essentially called God a serial murderer. Why didn't that end his career before his sexual misconduct did, right? Like, and so I kind of go through and talk about that. And it turns out that what Sinead O'Connor was protesting at the time, and nobody realized what she was doing, was the child molestation scandal in the Catholic Church.
Right.
And nobody knew it. Nobody, like Americans, had never even heard of it at the time. It was just starting to come out in Ireland and in Europe, and people were just ignoring it and saying it wasn't true. And
Sure.
she knew it was true because she had lived through it. She had been
Right.
abused, and she knew people who were being abused.
Yeah, I read a
But
little bit about that about her. She had written about it.
Right. But she didn't communicate that clearly in the protest. All anyone ever remembered was her ripping up the Pope. And so at the end of this chapter, I talk about a bunch of different things in this chapter, but at the end of this chapter, I essentially raise this issue that we're talking about. Kind of how do you stand up? How do you get along with people who believe or disbelieve? Or more specifically, how do you deal with people that you disagree with, right? It's because essentially what Sinead's doing is she is sacrificing her Korean reputation to take a stand up on something that she really, really believes in, and it ends her career, right? And this raises a really interesting question. When should we do that, right? Like, when is it worth it? When is it worth standing up for something that you think is important when you know it might cost you your relationship with your family, or your job, or your your career, or your friendships, or whatever, right? And it's really difficult because sometimes, we know that a lot of times people are not convinced by you arguing and standing up about something, right? So you could end up taking a big stand and having nothing to show for it. Like, you don't change anybody's mind. And so it did no good. Other times it might, right? Other times it may not matter, and it's too important to not stand up, even though you may not have anything to show for it. I have no answers to offer here specifically. But that just to offer that it's a difficult balancing act that you just have to basically do your best to find the balance in. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into which of the books that you have done do you think we should talk about now?
Well, we've already talked about Black Mirror.
Which is your latest?
Yeah, Inception is a little outdated. I have the Inception and Philosophy book, but it's a little outdated because that was back in 2011. Although I do expect to be working on Nolan's new film called Tenet, which looks really, really fascinating.
Yes, it does.
I will mention briefly, since we're talking about science fiction already anyway, my Sci-Fi course with the great courses. So it is not a book; it's a course with great courses. This is the guidebook that goes with it. It's an audio book on Audible if you're interested in that, or you can do it through the Great Courses app, Great Courses Plus. Or you can, you can find the DVD or the CD or whatever on Amazon. It essentially is a course where it's 24 lectures, and I essentially devote a lecture to, each lecture is devoted to a particular television show or movie, a science fiction television show or movie. And the premise of the course, the reason it's called Sci-Fi with a PHI, is because the premise is kind of like with the Black Mirror book. The idea is that science fiction can do philosophy. It can make arguments, it can raise philosophical questions just like philosophers do. And so the goal is to go through things like Inception and The Matrix and the Matrix sequels and Contact and Black Mirror and Star Trek and Doctor Who and Transcendence and Gattaca and 2001: A Space Odyssey and Starship Troopers and I'm trying to come up with more off the top of my head, but stuff like that.
There's lots.
Metropolis. I go all the way back to Metropolis, which is a 1920s
great
film.
Movie.
And like examine like what are they trying to say? What point are they trying to make? What are they trying to get at? What are they trying to argue? And is it right? Are they right? Is the conclusion correct or not? Essentially, I just go through 24 lectures of digging through science fiction, and it can be, if you want it to be, it can be a really fun kind of foray through science fiction, because I encourage the listener to go and watch the movie in question or watch a particular episode of the television show that we'll talk about to kind of, get themselves up on it or whatever. And then I come back and we do the lecture on it. It's never necessary. Like, I always kind of recap what happened in the movie or episode so that you don't have to have watched it. But it can be a really kind of fun journey through science fiction if you want it to be, because you can kind of familiarize yourself with 24 movies or films that, you haven't seen before, possibly haven't seen before. So yeah, and it's fun. There's lots of stuff about religion in there. In that particular course, one of my favorite lectures is the one on Contact. Carl Sagan's inspired, like Carl Sagan wrote the book, and then the movie was based on the book. And in that movie, Carl Sagan, right, like kind of, often thought of as a champion of atheist who actually, I believe he said he was actually agnostic. In that movie, he basically argues that science and religion are compatible.
thought was kind of odd.
It is odd, right? But it is odd. But that's definitely what he's arguing. And so I talk about the movie. I talk about essentially what the argument is he's presenting, and kind of deconstruct that and argue essentially that he's mostly wrong. That it's not quite compatible in the way that he thinks it is.
Right.
And we can at least clarify where the incompatibility is. It's possible to be religious and also scientific, but the religion has to be a very specific way. Most religion is not compatible with scientific belief. It's possible to do it, but again, it's a kind of a definitional issue. Depends on how you define religion. But
I have a more humorous, I think, question to ask you that my friend Randolph Richardson has asked here. I'll show you right here. Important philosophical question: which is the purpose of a cat? The best answer I've read is the purpose of a cat is to annoy you. So.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm not a cat fan. I think that's unless you're talking about Schrodinger's cat, and then the purpose of that cat is to disprove the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. There you go.
Yes, that's right. I have something I got to show you. Just one quick second.
Okay.
This is one of my favorite shirts that I picked up a while ago, and I haven't worn it in a while, so I actually should, because it gets a good laugh every once in a while. 100% dead, 100% alive.
Alive. That's nice. That is good.
Yeah, I thought I'd show you that for sure.
I love it.
Yeah. Every time I wear it around, people are like, I don't get it. I'm like, all right, well, then you don't know the Schrodinger cat thing, do you? Like, oh, nope, never heard of it.
Yeah, and most people misunderstand it to think that that's what quantum mechanics necessarily entails, that the cat is both 100% alive and 100% dead. But the point of Schrodinger's cat was to show that the Copenhagen interpretation, which would entail that the cat is both alive and dead, must be wrong, because it can't be both alive and dead. So
right, anyway. Exactly. And I've had to explain exactly that to the people that didn't understand it. And once they hear me go off about that, then I get the little chuckle, because they finally understand what it's about. Yeah. So, all right. So let's get on to the, we still got quite a bit of time left too.
Good. That's great. Because I got telling you, we can talk about arguments for and against God. We can talk about the Christmas book if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. The Christmas book, that kind of intrigued me. It's called The Myths That Stole Christmas.
That is correct.
Yeah,
there we go.
Let's talk a bit about that one, because that's really cool.
Yeah. So it's not a philosophy book per se. There's definitely some philosophy in it. I'm a philosopher. It's unavoidable. So I'll tell you just briefly the story that led to this book. I read William Hooper's self-published book, The Heathen's Guide to Christmas. I'd read his self-published Heathen's Guide to Religion, and liked it, enjoyed it. And then I'd read The Heathen's Guide to Christmas. But it's self-published. William was not a PhD. And so I was like, well, this sounds interesting. It's really intriguing. But I got to fact check this. I got to figure out, what he's getting right, if he's getting anything wrong or whatever. And so I started doing my own reading. And so I read A Candid Christmas History by, I believe, Forbes. I think that's right. And I read one by Kelly on Christmas history. I read Stephen Nussenbaum's The Battle for Christmas, which is absolutely fantastic. He's a hardcore historian. It is really good. And I kept doing this research and finding out where Cooper was wrong and right and that kind of stuff. I ended up teaching a course on it here at King's. We had this liberal arts seminar that was dedicated, that it could be themed, and the only purpose was to teach kids how to read and write more effectively. And so I just gave them a whole stack of books on Christmas, and we read all this stuff I'd been reading on Christmas. And it was fascinating. The kids loved it. It's just. I mean, they learn more than they ever thought there was to know about Christmas or whatever.
Right.
And I kept wanting to kind of put all my research and all the thoughts I had or whatever to into a book. On top of that, at the same time, I start getting interested in this question about why we lie to our kids about Santa Claus and whether we should. And so I published this article in the Baltimore Sun in 2009 called "Sorry, Virginia," where I very quickly argued that parents should stop lying to their kids about Santa Claus. Playing the game is okay, but don't trick them into literally believing something that you know is false. That turned into, like, I got the Psychology Today blog around that time, and so I started posting stuff on there. That became kind of a popular topic. I went on a few podcasts to talk about that. I was actually on, this is after the book was published, but last year I was on Sean Hannity's show talking about that. That was a nightmare. We can talk about that if you want to, but
let's do that a little bit after you're done with it.
Okay, but I essentially was like, I need to coalesce all my research into one book, and I actually wanted to use it for the Christmas class I was teaching, and so that's what I did. I put it all into one book, and essentially, the book is kind of there's a history chapter and then kind of a philosophy chapter, sort of history, philosophy. So I'll summarize it this way. It's right. The Myth, the Soul, Christmas. The subtitle is 7 Misconceptions That Hijack the Holiday and How We Can Take It Back. And so each chapter is a different myth, a different thing that's not actually true about Christmas, right? Okay. So myth number 1, Jesus is the reason for the season. No, he's not, right? If you know your history or whatever, you know that's not
the actual tilt of the earth is the reason for the season.
Exactly. Well, and specifically, right, like the tilt of the earth is what caused the celebrations that did exist
right, like
around the time Jesus would, like Saturnalia and that kind of stuff. Sol Invictus's birthday was on December 25th. Yep. But it was because the days started getting longer then, and that's when the worshipers of the sun thought the sun's birthday was. Yes. And so, like, that's like literally the reason we celebrate is because they celebrated then and the Christians co-opted that holiday. But anyway, so that's myth number 1, right? And it goes into detail about the history of it and how it developed over time and that kind of stuff. Myth number 2, there is a war on Christmas. No, there's not. I talk about that. Myth number 3, our Christmas traditions are old-fashioned. In that particular chapter, I get into the details of kind of recent Christmas history and how our current celebrations got to be the way they are. Most of the things that we do today at Christmas are at most 200 years old. They don't date back thousands of years.
Well, one of the things is the image of Santa today was brought on by Coca-Cola.
Well, okay, so that's not exactly accurate. Well, But I'll get to that.
They're partially responsible.
They're partly responsible. I'll get to that because that's myth number 5.
Okay.
So
look at me learning.
Myth number 3 is our Christmas traditions are old-fashioned. Myth number 4 is Christmas spending is good for the economy. I use a book among a few others called Scroogenomics to argue that that's not actually the case.
Scroogenomics. Yeah, I have to use that from now on.
Yeah, it's a little bit here. I'll show it to you. 1 second. Because it's the book itself it's that big. It's called Scroogenomics: Why You Shouldn't Buy Gifts for the Holidays, and it's actually sized specifically to fit in a stocking.
Perfect.
It's a great book. It is an absolutely great book. But Joe Waldfogel is the author of that book. But in that chapter, I talk about his arguments and a few others to make the case that Christmas spending is not actually good for the economy. It could be if we did it different, but mainly the way it'd have to be different is we'd have to actually do charity with it instead of giving gifts.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So myth number 5 is that Santa Claus is Saint Nicholas. So I argue that he's actually not, that both Santa and St. Nicholas find their origins from an earlier pagan god, actually. And that... it's actually, well, it doesn't have a specific name. Phyllis Schiefer calls it the wild man. If you've ever, you know of Krampus, I assume everybody knows of Krampus now, yes. Right? Krampus is kind of based on the wild man, and there's a whole thing about where that comes from. But essentially, it's this older half man, half beast deity that kind of bifurcates, and half of it's St. Nicholas and the other half is Krampus, and there's a whole thing. But St. Nicholas was wearing furs and that kind of stuff. And Santa Claus was around before Coca-Cola. What Coca-Cola contributed most specifically to Santa's look was the red and white.
That's more what I meant. The red and white suit came from them. Yeah.
Yes. So he had suits of fur. So this picture on the cover of him of St. Nicholas Santa Claus shoving a kid into a bag, that's from the early 1900s, and you can see that he's wearing red and it's a fur suit there. That comes before the Coca-Cola campaign, but he also wore other colors. Like, people would depict him a whole bunch of different ways. He would wear blue suits or green suits or brown suits. His color was not selected, right?
Right.
And it's essentially the Coca-Cola campaign in I think it's the 20s or 30s that solidifies his colors as Coca-Cola red and white. And that's the main thing that they contribute is the red and white. Maybe the belt, maybe the big black belt that goes around, that might have been part of the campaign too. But the red and white color is where comes from Coca-Cola.
Before we continue, I have a quick question again from Randolph. It's more of a serious question, and he kind of wanted to know because he has to take off to go for dinner. So, serious question for you guys. Solipsism involves a single mind. Is there a term that can be used for multiple minds, such as polysolipsism? Thanks.
So I don't think so, unless you might think about panpsychism. So all right, so there's solipsism, who would think that there's only one mind. It's mind. It's my mind, right? And then you could be someone who believes in other minds. Now, there is this thing in philosophy called the problem of other minds, which essentially is this question of how do you know that other people are minded? And I think you can use inference as the best explanation to solve that. But that's just kind of like the baseline belief. Like everybody kind of believes everybody has minds. And so I don't think it has a special title because it's just kind of automatic.
Like a default position almost.
Right. Panpsychism is the belief that everything has a mind. And so individual atoms have minds.
Oh, wow.
My tungsten top has a mind. Everything to a certain degree has a mind. It might be more or less, right? But that's what panpsychism, pan just means all, right? So panpsychism, everything has a psychology, everything has a mind. But I don't think that there's a specific name to, I believe that all other humans have minds. I don't think that view has a name. I could be wrong. But.
Yeah, I've not heard of anything myself other than what he was talking about, this solipsism being of a single mind. Like we can only, and can we even prove that our minds are real either, right? The whole brain in a jar thing, right? We don't know. Yeah.
Well, with the brain in the vat, you know that your own mind exists. Right. Because you're aware of it. Right. The problem there is, can you know that anything else exists? Not even just other people's minds. Can you even know that other people exist? They might be just a product of the illusion that's being fed to your brain. Right. That's akin to kind of Nozick's experience machine. But but then even if you grant that the world is real, you have this other problem. How can I know that other people are minded? Because I can only experience my mind myself. Right.
Yeah. Your panpsychism, that you were talking about there might actually help, as Randolph says in the comments there, that Deepak Chopra thinks that water has memory. So that actually help him out with that. But I don't want to give Chopra any boosts up at all, really, because it's all about woo nonsense.
Yeah, right. No, and I'm not a panpsychist either, right? So I don't think that view has a lot of arguments for it or anything like that. I'm just like that. I do know that's a view that's held and it has a name. Right.
So
anyway, yeah.
So let's get on to, before we bring this to an end, let's get on to the arguments for God that you feel are, I guess, valid. Would that be a proper term?
No, they're invalid.
Oh, they're invalid. Okay.
Yes.
Let's do this.
Right. So I'm actually... I have three. Right now I have. Okay. Back up. I have more than this. I often publish in a journal called Think that's edited by Stephen Law. Two of the articles I have in there are called. One's called "Do Souls Exist?" And the other one's called "Does Free Will Exist?" And I've always wanted to complete the trilogy with "Does God Exist?" And I've actually recently done that. It's not published yet, but I've written it. It's been accepted, and it's going to be coming out in Think. Forthcoming. I'm not sure what issue, but it should be coming out soon. And so I say that to say that if you want the details of what I'm about to lay out here, it's going to be in that chapter or that article.
Sure.
Essentially, though, there are two main arguments for God's existence that people often trot out as when they try to prove that God exists. One is the cosmological argument, specifically the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yep.
And then the other one
with that
is the teleological argument, most specifically the fine-tuning argument, the idea that the universe is fine-tuned. Essentially, I was somewhat convinced by these at one point in my life, right? Thinking that they were good. And I've since realized that they don't work. And they actually fail for a number of different reasons. Again, all laid out in the article that will be forthcoming. And other people
I'm gonna have to look up this.
And other people have pointed it out too. I've just kind of coalesced all the arguments into like kind of one shorter article for this. So I can't say specifically that anything like this is completely original, although maybe what I'm about to tell you is somewhat original.
You heard it here first, folks.
Maybe. Well, I mean, it's in the paper, right? So anyway, one of the big problems with the Kalam cosmological argument is that it begs the question. It argues in a circle. It assumes the truth of what it's trying to prove.
The question fallacy. Yep.
And essentially, the way that it does that is the prime. So the cosmological argument is an argument that suggests that God must exist because where did the universe come from? God must be responsible for the existence of the universe, right? And then, of course, the reply is like, the kind of natural reply is, well, then where did God come from? Right. And then people will say, well, God doesn't need a creator. He just is. Right.
Special pleading. Right.
Well, but the reply is, right, why isn't that just special pleading? If you can say that God doesn't need a creator, why can't I just say the universe doesn't need one?
Right.
Right. And the Kalam cosmological argument is a kind of answer to that. The Kalam cosmological argument says, well, the reason that God doesn't need a creator, but the universe does, is because things that begin to exist need a cause. God didn't begin to exist, the universe did. And so I can say that God doesn't need a cause because he didn't begin to exist, but the universe did begin to exist, so I can say that it needs a cause. That's essentially the cosmological argument.
I think God's mom might argue that.
Right, well, so the issue then is this. To establish that, they have to make this assumption. Yep. Things that begin to exist need a cause, right? And as evidence that this principle is true, right? They will point to objects that have begun to exist and say that they had an explanation for how they came to existence. They had a cause for their existence, right? Sure. So you can look at, right, the top I pointed to before, that somebody made that off a lathe somewhere, right? You can look at the timer I used to time how long that type spins. You can look at the book. You can look at my headphones. You can look at the pillows, right? Like on and on and on. And these are all things that began to exist, and they had an explanation, or they were created to have an explanation for their existence. Right? And so there's your evidence for that principle. And it's like, well, the problem is this, though. When you talk about those particular objects coming into existence and them having an explanation, what are you actually explaining, right? Mm-hmm. And what you're actually explaining is how the matter that makes up those objects came to be in the configuration that it is, right? Mm-hmm. So when I explain how the top came into being, right, I can give you a causal explanation for like who took the metal and who shaped it and who put the aluminum stem on it, et cetera, right? I can give you that explanation for how that came to be.
Sure, right down to the elements that are involved.
Right, but the tungsten itself, right, like that was formed in a star, right? Like, right, a star collapsed and created blah, blah, and shoved atoms together.
Everything in us.
Right, right, exactly. Like, right, you're not explaining where the matter that makes up the top came from. You're explaining the configuration, right? So all the examples that the Kalam cosmological argument gives as a support for that first premise, that everything that begins to exist needs a cause, actually only supports the premise that things have an explanation for how they became configured, right? Like anything that's configured the way it is has an explanation for how it became configured that way, right? But you're not actually explaining the existence of the material itself.
Right.
Right? And so the argument, at that point, the argument just equivocates. Right? When it talks about like things like the top have an explanation for how they came into existence, the universe came into existence, therefore the universe has a cause. Those first two premises are talking about something different, right? Mm-hmm. The premise about the objects are talking about configuration. Mm-hmm. The premise about the universe is talking about matter coming into existence. So the argument's not valid. It's talking about two different concepts, configuration, coming into existence. And so the argument's invalid. It equivocates on the word essentially comes into existence. Right. Yeah. And so to fix the argument, what you can do is change that first premise and say, okay, well, I'll make that first premise about matter coming into existence. So you essentially have to change the first premise to whenever matter comes into existence, then it must have a cause.
The cause, yeah.
Right? The universe came into existence, therefore the universe must have a cause. Here's the problem. The one and only time that matter came into existence was when the universe came into existence. And so, right?
It almost self-negates.
Right? Well, that doesn't self-negate. It argues in a circle.
Oh,
right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right? Okay. Like the first premise is saying whenever matter comes into existence, it must have an explanation. So when the universe came into existence, it must have an explanation. Those are the same thing. The only way that you would accept that first premise is if you already accepted the conclusion And so the argument goes in a circle.
Runs around in circles.
Right. And so
like a merry-go-round.
Yeah. So it just assumes the truth of what you're trying to prove. At best, it kind of draws attention to people's intuition that matter must have a cause for its existence. But of course, it turns out that's false too. In quantum mechanics, we actually know that matter comes into existence uncaused all the time. It's called vacuum fluctuations.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. And Ed Tryon has a very convincing article that suggests that that's exactly what our universe could be, just a very large vacuum fluctuation. And so cosmological argument begs the question, no good. So the fine-tuning argument is got numerous things wrong with it. Which one should I go over? I'll go over an easy one. One problem with the fine-tuning argument is that if the universe is fine-tuned, it is not fine-tuned for the creation of life. So the fine-tuning argument is that the universe has just the specific properties it must in order for it to support life. If any one thing was different, then life couldn't exist in the universe anymore. So aren't we lucky that they're all just right? In other words, or so the argument goes. The argument is that, so look at all the parameters, they're all just right in order for life to evolve. The parameters being like that, conducive to life, the universe being fine-tuned for life, that fact is much more probable on theism than atheism. So that counts as evidence for theism. It doesn't prove theism, but it counts as evidence for theism, right? So that's the argument. All right. So I'm going to go over three. I'm going to go over three problems with this argument. One, the universe, if it is fine-tuned at all, is not fine-tuned for life, because if the vast majority of it is dark energy, right? Like 70% of it is dark energy.
Something like that. Yeah.
Most of the rest of it is dark matter, right? Only like 4% of it is visible matter, right? And then most of that is stars. Only a minuscule little chunk of that is things like planets, right? And then a minuscule chunk of that is like most planets don't have life, right? So a very minuscule part of that, so far, right. Well, I mean, even if you just look at the solar system, right? Like if we just extrapolate from the solar system, right? Like 1 out of 8 planets has life, like at best, right? And that's really like being generous, right?
Not including the moons.
Right.
We're still looking for the plausibility of life being on somewhere like Europa, for example.
Right. But just so I mean, but you can extrapolate, like look at all the matter in just in our solar system, right? And how much of it even possibly has life, right? Like Earth and maybe Europa, that's it, right? It's right. Most of the solar system is hostile to life, right?
We should have a caveat in there: life as we know it.
Right. Well, I mean, even life as we know it, like any kind of even possibly biologically conceivable life can't exist in the vacuum of space, right? Like at least be active, right? Like
tardigrades. Tardigrades could,
right? They can be in hibernation, I believe, right?
Yeah, some sort of stasis that they put themselves in.
But they've only done that because they figured out how to, to survive in the hostility, right? The hostility of the vacuum, right? But the point is, right? Like I believe the figure is like 0.03% of the universe is like solid matter, right? Like I shouldn't say solid matter, but like like matter that life could exist on, and then even a fraction of that actually is life, and an even smaller fraction of that is intelligent life, right? The vast majority of the universe is hostile to life, and so it's simply false to say that the universe is fine-tuned for the creation of life.
I would agree with that.
To say that the universe is fine-tuned for the creation of life is like saying that your toaster is fine-tuned to create crumbs that happen. Like
I have to use that. That's
right.
Great.
Like that is something that your toaster does. It creates crumbs to fill up the crumb catcher, right?
But that only like 0.0 something
right.
percent.
Right. Like it's made for making toast, right? And the crumbs are just a kind of an afterthought, something that just happens to happen as a result of making toast, right? If the universe is fine-tuned for anything, it's for making galaxies, right? And a possible crumb of that, like a little byproduct of that, is the occasional spring of life in the universe, right? Okay, that's the first problem. Second problem, the universe isn't fine-tuned at all. And here's why. The fine-tuning argument is actually fallacious. All right. So the argument is,
I agree with you.
Right. So the argument is, look at all the different parameters of the universe, right? So here, let's say that there's 10 of them, right? If this one was different, then life could not evolve anymore. Therefore, this must so aren't we lucky that we have the one and only, like all these values have the one and only value that they could have for life to take place, right? That argument is fallacious. Here's why. Suppose I stumble across a square. I'll use my Euler's identity square, right? So I come across a square, right? And I observe of the square quite rightly, like, look at this. If any one of these sides were any different in length, it wouldn't be a square anymore. Aren't we lucky that this square has the one and only length side, like it has the sides that are exactly the one and only length that sides can be in order for squares to exist? Obviously,
not true.
Obviously, that's fallacious.
Yes.
Right? To go, well, look, if that one was longer, it wouldn't be a square anymore. Therefore, this must be the only way that squares can exist. That's obviously fallacious. And yet, that is exactly the argument that they just gave. Look at the parameters. If this one was different, life couldn't evolve anymore. Aren't we lucky that we have the one and only parameters that we must have in order for life to evolve? No, there could be other parameters. Like if you change this one, what if you change this one too? Would things balance out so that life could still evolve? Victor Reppert, not Victor Reppert, sorry, wrong Victor. Where's the book? Victor Stenger. Victor Reppert does the argument from reason, and that's a different debate. Victor Stenger, he's a scientist actually, has like run simulations, and other people have run these simulations where if you allow variations in all the parameters, you get life-conducive universes about half the time. Right? Just like if you varied the sides of the square randomly, you'd get quite a bit, different squares of different sizes, right? But you can get squares different ways. You can have life-conducive. You can have life.
All you need to do to change that, what you were saying about the square, if one was shorter than the other, is add three more, and you've got a bigger square.
Exactly. Yeah. Right? Like, or if this one became longer, we'll make all the other ones longer, and
you're back to a square.
Exactly. Right. And it actually turns out that a number of the variables that the fine-tuning argument often points to and says, well, if this was a little bit different, then life couldn't evolve anymore. It turns out that a lot of them are actually linked, so that if you change this one, it automatically changes this one and it balances out. For example, great example. One of the examples that's often used in the fine-tuning argument is the mass of neutrinos, which is, I'm going to go off memory here. I think it's 5 times 10 to the negative 23rd. It's in the paper. All right. But let's say it's 23. All right. You can correct me. The number sort of matters, but they use an exponential mode. It's like 5 times 10.
42.
Maybe. So it's something like, I think it's like 5 times 10 to the negative 23rd, something along that line. Right. And so they say aren't we lucky that it's not 22 or 24, right? I think it's actually 36. I think if we're lucky, it's not 35 or 37. So let's go with 36. Right? Aren't we lucky it's not negative times 10 to the 35 or the 37th? Because if neutrinos were to the 35th, right, they'd be more massive, and their mass would make up so much of the universe that when the Big Bang happened, the universe would just collapse back in on itself, and life wouldn't be possible, right? And if it's 37, they'd be so light that the universe would fly apart, essentially, and life wouldn't be possible. Aren't we lucky that it's 36, right? Okay, so there's 2 things to say about this.
Wish I was 36 again.
Yeah, no kidding, me too. So there's 2 things to say about this. One, it turns out that that's only true if you hold the number of neutrinos in the universe as a constant. If you have all the number of neutrinos the same, and then you increase or lower their mass, then the universe becomes lighter or heavier accordingly, right? But it turns out that the size of neutrinos is directly proportional to their mass. They're linked because of conservation, so that if you did increase their mass, there would be fewer of them, and the total mass of them would be the same, and so it would have no effect on the universe at all. Right? So they're just wrong that, well, if you change this one, life wouldn't evolve. No, if you change this one automatically adjusts because of conservation, and you wouldn't have anything, right? Then the other thing that's fun about this is that it's using essentially sleight of hand to make the fine-tuning seem more ridiculous than it does, or more unlikely than it does, right? So again, when it says what the mass of neutrinos is 5 times 10 to the negative 36th, or whatever, negative 36 kilograms. That's important, right? It's 5 times 10 to the negative 36 kilograms, right? Kilograms is the unit of measure you use to weigh people, right? Normal, every size objects, right? Neutrinos are so small, there's like 1 million of them passing through your pinky right now, right? They're very, really, really small. They pass through solid matter without most of them, without even touching any matter at all. They just pass through the empty space in matter, right? And you're going to measure them in kilograms. Well, of course, if you measure something that small in kilograms, any little tiny adjustment of that kilogram measurement is going to make magnanimous effects on the mass of that thing, right? And it's going to make it seem like it's much more fine-tuned than it is, right? Where if you measured it in something that was more proportional, it wouldn't seem that way. Let me give you an example. I'm borrowing from an article, and the name is slipping me right now. The article's called "The Fine-Tuning Argument," but it's Neil Manson's article, "The Fine-Tuning Argument." Okay. He gives this
another
example.
Neil. I like it.
Yes. Good. So he argues that, suppose I gave you this argument. Did you know that Michael Jordan is 1 × 10⁻16 light year tall? If he was 1 × 10⁻15, he'd be too short to play basketball. And if he was 1 × 10⁻17, he'd be too tall to play basketball. Yeah. He is just the right height to play basketball. There's no other height that he could have than what he has to play basketball. Well, if he was 1 × 10⁻15, he'd be like, it's like 3.5 inches tall. I mean, it's like he'd be like this tall. Like that. Yeah. Right. And if he was 5 × 10⁻15, he'd be a lumbering giant at like 59 feet or something like that. Right. By measuring
featured in a monster movie.
Exactly. Right. So by measuring his height in light years, right, I make the height that he actually has seem much more like fine-tuned than it actually is. Right. In reality, he could differ in either direction by 6 or 7 inches, right? He could be 6 foot, he could be 7 foot. He's actually 6'6", sure. Right? He could be 6 foot, he could be 7 foot. He'd still probably be one of the greatest players ever played the game, right? Yeah. It's not that fine tuned. There are a number of different heights that he could actually have. Same thing is true for neutrinos. You could actually vary their mass and keep their number the same by a significant degree, like proportionally speaking, right? Given their mass, you could make them go up according to their own mass quite a bit, and it wouldn't actually affect the universe at all. It wouldn't make life impossible, right? And so the argument's kind of using sleight of hand by using kilograms to measure neutrinos to make their the fine-tuning of their weight seem much more fine-tuned than they actually are, right? It was realizations like this that led me to believe that the arguments for God just do not work.
Right.
And I mean, those are the best ones. Like, I'm not straw manning here, right? The Kalam cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument are like the golden standard of arguments that are like, this proves that God exists, and they just fail miserably. They just they're no good.
And you've even convinced me more of that now.
Oh, good, good. So, and then combine that with the fact that I think that the problem of evil does not actually have a good answer. Specifically, I don't think the problem of natural evil has a good answer. And I've got some papers on that if people want to look at that. But that to me makes atheism the more rational position. So, because I proportion my belief to the evidence.
Yeah. Earlier on, I noticed in the chat that Dr. Darren Slade had a quick questions for you.
Hi, Dan.
Bob here. He wants to know when you're going to be featured in Skeptics magazine.
Oh, right. Okay, good. So Darren's helped me out a little bit with this. So I have an article forthcoming in Skeptics magazine on a new fallacy I think I named. Maybe I'm crossing articles here. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I've got 2 things coming out in Skeptic magazine. Okay, so I have one about this new fallacy, and that's coming out soon. And then I have this other one that tries to clarify the conflict between science and religion. The fallacy thing is like 2 pages. It's pretty short. The other one's a little bit longer. It's an actual kind of full article, around 4,000, 5,000 words, something like that. Nice one, Holy Kool-Aid. That's good. It's this article on clarifying the conflict between science and religion. And what Darren actually helped me out with is it's got to go through the peer review process and all that kind of stuff to eventually come out. But sure. The shorter version of this article where I try to clarify exactly where the conflict between science and religion lays is going to be in Skeptics magazine, and then the kind of longer, more fleshed out version will hopefully eventually be in German. But it's an argument that essentially tries to lay out. I take on 2 big arguments on this Gould's Noma thesis, the idea that there's non-overlapping magisteria. Am I talking foreign language to you, or have you heard of that before?
This is a new one for me. Yes.
Okay, all right. So I'll elaborate on that. And then there is another one called The Limits of Science by Medwar.
That one sounds familiar to me.
Oh, really? I figured it would go the other way. Okay, good.
No, seriously. The other one that you mentioned, the Goulds, is something that I've not heard of.
Okay, so Gould has this very famous article called Non-Overlapping Magisteria. And he argues that science and religion cannot conflict because they're about different things. They're in two magisteria, two realms, the subject matter of which does not overlap. And so they can't conflict because they're basically about two different things. Mm-hmm. That's the argument. And one of the things that's wrong with that argument is that the assumption is just false. It's not the case that they're not actually overlapping magisteria, right? Essentially, for that argument to work, religion has to only be about like ethics and meaning. It can only be about what's right and wrong and what the meaning of life is. And if that's right, if religion were only about that and only made claims about ethics and meaning, then okay, yeah, science would be separate because science deals with the observable world, it deals with natural phenomena, et cetera, et cetera. It can't answer ethical questions. Maybe it can help out a little bit. I talk a little bit about that in the article, but basically it's kind of silent on that, and it's not going to tell us about the meaning of life, right? It can't tell us that. It can tell us all about nature and how to save it. It can't tell us that nature is valuable. It can tell us that it's necessary for human life, but it can't tell us that human life is valuable. That's for philosophy or religion to do, right? But the problem is that's not all religion talks about. Religion doesn't just say things about ethics and meaning. It says things about what's happened in the world. Like it said that, Jesus rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. It says that miracles occur, right? It says that God exists. The global flood happened, right? It says miracles have occurred and do occur, right? Like it says that souls exist. None of these are claims about ethics and meaning. They're either claims about something that actually happened in the world, or they're claims
something that could be measured too.
Or something. A lot of times it can be measured, right? Or they're metaphysical claims that criteria of adequacy can actually be drawn upon, right? So I think that this is my Think article called Do Souls Exist? I think neuroscience actually shows that they don't, right? 100% prove no, but you can't 100% prove anything. But it gives us really good reason for thinking that souls don't exist, right?
You could be 99.9999% sure on something. Yeah, I always say.
Right. Yeah, that knowledge does not require certainty. That's true. Yeah. If it did, we couldn't know anything because I can't tell you. I can't prove that I'm not in the Matrix right now, right?
Yeah.
So, I just lost my train of thought. So,
apologies.
Oh no, that's okay. So, like Gould specifically says that the soul is a religious he says that the soul is a religious claim that science can speak nothing of, and it's like that's false. That's absolutely false. There's a good reason that almost all neuroscientists, if not all of them, don't believe that souls exist. They're not dualists, right? Because the science is pretty definitive on that, right? You can't have mental activity without a functioning brain,
right?
So your mental activity can't attach itself and float away when you die. And so these are all claims that science can actually, And so essentially in the article, I argue that science and religion are not incompatible only if religion is only about ethics and meaning, and that's all it's about. And for some people, that actually gets back to something I said earlier in the cast. For some people, that's how they treat religion. Some people are religious and they claim to be religious, but it's all a metaphor. It's all right. Like the Bible is not literally true. The miracles didn't really happen. It's all morality tales to inform the way that you live your life, et cetera, et cetera. And if that's their approach, that's fine. People will argue about them, whether that's really religious or not, or whether they're really Christian, That's not a debate. That's for them to decide, right? If that is how you approach religion, absolutely it's compatible with science. Right. In the same way that being a big fan of Lord of the Rings is compatible with science, because I don't literally believe in it. Right. Like when I say Frodo lives, right, as a fan of Lord of the Rings, right, I don't really mean that there was a hobbit who actually lived in history and he is still alive. Right. Like that is not at all what I mean. Right. And so my non-literal metaphorical meaning, right, of Frodo lives, right, that statement can be true metaphorically, and that's fine, and it's not incompatible with science at all. And if that's what you mean by Jesus lives, then science can't touch it, right?
Yeah,
Like it would be ridiculous to argue. It would be as ridiculous to argue against that scientifically as it would to be scientifically to give a scientific argument for why Frodo isn't actually alive, right? Like you've missed the point if that's what you're thinking, right? So if that's what you're doing with religion, it can't, right? The problem, of course, is that that's not what most people are doing with religion, right? Like,
nope.
A few theologians I know do that with religion. A few pastors I know maybe do that with religion, but most people do not. Right? They literally think that Jesus rose from the dead. They literally think the miracles occurred. They literally think miracles still occur. Right? Yep. That is not a belief that is compatible with science. Right?
I would agree.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the Skeptics Magazine article that's going to be coming out. Again, I got the one on the fallacy. It's called the Countless Counterfeits Fallacy, if you're interested in that. And then this other one on science, religion, and then the full fleshed out argument will be in Sherm. And here's another one, except for I can't remember. Okay, I'm going to butcher this, but I'm going to do it anyway. There is a, because I can't remember the name of the editor of the book, and I should be able to look it up, but I can't remember it. So long story short, but I'm kind of excited about this. There is a big, huge philosophy of religion textbook that's coming out, like a philosophy of religion handbook, right? Maybe textbook's not the right word, handbook's the right word. But it'll be used in classes and that kind of stuff. And a lot of big wigs are in it, big major publisher or whatever. Most of the articles will be kind of like encyclopedia entries, not longer than that though, but kind of like, this is where the debate on this particular topic stands. Here's what the different people say on that issue, on the big issues in philosophy of religion. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the book, they are going to include 5 or 6 chapters, I believe, that are all why I am X, why I am a Muslim, why I'm a Christian, why I'm a Jew. I got the why am I an atheist one.
Okay.
So there's going to be why am I agnostic, and then there's the why I'm an atheist, and I've got that one. It's only going to be like 4,000 words. I'm going to have to cram a lot in there.
Only 4,000.
But I'm very, very excited about writing that and being in this book because I think it'll be a great way to make the case.
Sure. Have you started writing on it, or?
In a certain kind of way, I have. My due date's not till this. Well, actually, no, my due date's not for a while. My due date in here is this summer. I'm going to have it done by the end of this summer. Okay. But I actually have a little bit more time than that to do it. But in a certain kind of way, I've started working on it. In fact, the Does God Exist article that I was talking about that's going to be coming out in Think, that's part of it, because what I want to actually do in this chapter is kind of lay out a comprehensive case for atheism, but there's no way to actually do that in 4,000 words. So what I'm going to do is, like, one reason is the arguments for God don't work. Here's a really brief, like couple paragraphs on why, but if you want the full story, go to that paper. Right. And then science and religion are compatible, and I want to be scientific. Right. And so I don't think that these and so if you want to know why that, go to the Sherm paper. Right. Like, and so I've started working on kind of getting everything in order so I can have things to footnote. So if people are interested, I can flesh out the full argument kind of in detail in these other articles. But I haven't started writing that particular article yet, but I got it. Like, I kind of know how it's going to go.
All right. Here's one more for you before we jump into an after party.
Right. Yes. So, thanks, Darren. So Darren and I co-wrote, and there's a number of other people involved at this point. This has to do with Trump and evangelicalism. That essentially, long story short, we are in a project that is working on an open letter to evangelicals who do not support Trump. It is not addressed to evangelicals who do support Trump. That's, I mean, I don't want to be rude or whatever, but like there's not much effort. There's not much use in wasting time trying to argue people in that camp out. Mm-hmm. It's addressed to people who still identify as evangelicals and who are evangelical, but who kind of see Trump for who he is and understand that he's immoral and oppose him. Right. And the letter essentially is calling them to join us in repudiating the leaders and institutions of evangelicalism that have wed themselves to Trump. And it's a friendly letter. It is not hostile. It is not aimed at all at of like getting rid of evangelicalism or making them where they can't use the word anymore or anything like that. It is trying to get those who are in evangelicalism to kind of stand up for what's right more fervently, so that they can prune off this corrupt political part of it, so that evangelicalism can be a force for good as a whole in the world today. Because it's not like now, it's not. It's like 80% of evangelicals, 80% support Trump and are all in no matter what he does, right? And for the 20%, the 25% that recognize that that's a bad thing, we think it's time for them to kind of stand up and say, we're divorcing ourselves from this, not stop being evangelical, but divorcing themselves from the leaders and institutions that are so wedded to Trump. And so what we're looking for is it's not an open letter. It's not like it's not an online petition. We're looking for people who are evangelical, who are formerly evangelical, who are religious scholars, who are religious leaders, to join us in this call. So it's like the letter is not public yet. We're working on getting signatures. And so what I guess I would like to say is, if anyone in your audience fits that category, evangelical, former evangelical, or religious leader, religious scholar, something along that line, if you're interested in seeing the letter and potentially signing it, please contact me, davidjohnson@kings.edu.
There's plenty of ways to do that down below, guys.
I'll ask you about it, like, what your background is and that kind of stuff, to see if you're appropriate to be a signatory. Hopefully you'd like to sign the letter. And it will eventually, like, the plan for it is for it to be published on SHRM's website. And it will be publicly released that way. And then there'll be a press release and that kind of stuff. And hopefully it will kind of garner the attention. It's essentially,
I have SHRM bookmarked, by the way.
Okay, good. So it's essentially, it's kind of an answer to the open letter I assume you're aware of the Christianity Today article that came out calling for Trump to be removed from office. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I just heard about that earlier yesterday morning.
Okay, so it's been out for a while. It came out in December. And Christianity Today, which is an evangelical, very conservative magazine, the outgoing editor-in-chief wrote this article that said he needs to be removed from office, whether by impeachment or not electing him, he needs to be gone. And essentially is worried that evangelicals, tying themselves to Trump has degraded their moral credibility, and if they keep going with it, they're going to lose all moral credibility. It's going to take, like, Trump's going to go down. It's going to take all evangelicalism with him, right? And so he's like, we need to divorce ourselves from him and separate ourselves. In response to that, 200 evangelical leaders wrote an open letter, all signed an open letter. Essentially, it was in response to the article, but it really didn't respond to it at all. It lauded his electoral victory. It championed, like, it told all the things that Trump has done that they like, which, golly, the Christianity Today article, like, clearly states, like, yeah, I know he's done stuff that we like, but it's not worth the cost, right? But they just say, oh, he's done all these things that we like. And essentially, like, the moral concern that is addressed in the Christianity Today article, like, he is immoral, and he's very specifically immoral. He's immoral in these kind of ways where we're losing our credibility by tying ourselves to him, et cetera, et cetera. The only reply they give to that in the open letter is, hey, that's okay, because, let me put it this way. They specifically say something: we are proud to be, to join the ranks of people like Jesus, who the elite criticized for being too friendly with sinners and tax collectors. Right. So they're invoking,
that's a baseball moment. I don't know what is.
Yeah. Right. Like, they're invoking Jesus's mission to the oppressed, right? Sinners and tax collectors, to the lowest in society that it oppressed. Right. And his, he forgave them because they were repentant. Right. So his mission to the oppressed in society and repentant sinners, right, to say that, Trump can do what he wants, it's okay. Jesus hung out with sinners, so it's fine. Right. And you don't need to be a biblical scholar, right, to know that is a complete and utter perversion of the gospel.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so that's kind of what motivated the letter, was that open letter from them. And so this is kind of a reply to that, saying that if that's what they're doing, and that's the kind of arguments they're making, and they're willing to excuse Trump's behavior because Jesus hung out with sinners, then it's time to divorce yourself from those leaders and institutions. Yeah,
for sure.
Not asking them to renounce evangelicalism, just like an example, like,
renounce fucking Trump is what you gotta do.
Right. I mean, in the letter, we actually say like what this looks like, what it means to repudiate the leaders and institutions of evangelicalism who have wed themselves to Trump. We leave that up to you. Like what you think that looks like. You know, what like an example it could look like is somebody who opposes Trump still goes to a church that clearly endorses him, and you know most people in the congregation do, and the pastor saying pro-Trump thing and that kind of stuff. It's probably time to go. It's not probably. It's time to go and to be loud about why. That's the kind of the motivation, or at least behind the letter. So again, if you fit that category and you're interested, please email me.
You've got a new fan.
Hey, thanks,
Probably
Angie.
because of the Star Trek pillows.
Hey, thanks. A friend of mine gave those to me. He'll be Steve Fellon. My friend Steve Fellon gave me those. Yeah, I'm not even sure.
I need those.
I'm not even sure. So a friend of mine named Steve Fellon got me those for me a few years ago. I have no idea where he got them.
Well, they say Google is always listening, so I'm sure it'll start popping up in the advertising.
Probably will.
All right. What do you say we get out of here? And I'm going to take a quick break to go have a pee and refresh a couple of beers and a quick cigarette. And we'll jump into an after party because I know there's people that want to come and say hello.
Absolutely. The only other thing we didn't talk about was me being on Sean Hannity.
Oh, right. Well, we can talk about that in the after party.
Yeah, that's fine. If people want to look it up, it's online. Just do David Kyle Johnson, Sean Hannity, and Santa Claus. It was about Santa Claus and lying to your kids about Santa. Look it up. It's like a 5-minute segment. They talked over me most of the time.
Oh, geez.
But I don't think I'm sorry I did it. Sometimes I'm sorry I did it, but I think I did some good. Actually, we'll close out with this. When I did that, the night I did it, I was berated with tweets and Facebook messages and emails and that kind of stuff.
Oh,
but one of them was an evangelical minister who said, after watching your segment, I am done with Fox News. They were so unkind and so unfair to you. It is so obviously clearly biased. I'm done. Bravo. That made it worth it. One pastor giving it up. That was good enough for me. So anyway, that's it.
That's fantastic, actually, to get something like that from an evangelical pastor. That's great. Well, Kyle, man, thank you so much for joining me today for this episode.
Thanks for having me on.
Like Angie said, I feel smarter too.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
What a teacher likes to hear. That's what a teacher likes to hear.
Absolutely. And I did learn lots tonight. So thank you for that. And once again, thank you for joining me. And also thanks to everyone for hanging out with us. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, because this is probably... I love all the episodes that I do, but certain ones stand out, and this one's going to be stuck in my memory for quite some time. And another one actually was with V, who's in the audience, and also with Dr. Slade as well.
Darren's great. Darren's
he was really good too.
Darren's a good guy.
They're all good episodes, and I pick up little bits of knowledge from everyone that I talk to, which is one of the reasons I love doing this. Plus, I think that these sort of things help people that might be having belief issues, and whether or not they should, and to let them know that there is a community of us out here willing to accept.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, guys, we're going to get into an after party. If you are interested in jumping in to say hello to Kyle, just let me know via Twitter or Facebook if you're not on Twitter. I'd love to have you in the show. We may get quite a few people wanting, and I can only have 4 other than me and Kyle, so we might rotate people in and out. So be aware of that. And until next time, guys, like I always say at the end of these things, like the late, great Christopher Hitchens once said, it's called faith because it's not knowledge. And we'll see you guys next time.